Hello and welcome to Byte Basics. I'm Earl Yeager. On Byte Basics, we strive to make sure that you know all the things about computers that people always assume you know, whether or not that's the case. Today we're going to look at buying a computer. And when you go to buy a computer, you're confronted with all of these product labels. And these product labels sometimes are a little bit difficult to understand. What are all of these numbers? What do they mean? What's important to me when I look at buying a computer? So I'm going to go over a lot of these different product labels. Just to be very clear, I don't endorse any particular company's machine or any particular reseller of computers. That's up to you to decide for yourself, as well as what your budget range is, all of those items. That's for you to make a decision upon. I'm just going to go over all of the numbers and what those numbers mean to help you make a better, more informed decision when you go to buy a computer. So if you go ahead and look with me over at my computer here, I'm going to look at a basic product label here. This particular product label contains a lot of information on it. So when we're looking at this product label, we're confronted with this Intel Core i5 and then a number, and then it's a laptop. And it says that it has a 15.6-inch screen, and then we have 8 gig of something called DDR3, 750 GB or gigabytes of something else called hard drive. And what does all this mean? What is important on this? Why do I care about any of these numbers? So when we're looking at these numbers, I think the only number that's clear to most people is the screen size type number. Now that number is the diagonal measurement from one corner to the opposite corner of your computer's laptop screen. So if you're looking at a laptop and it has that, that's going to be that screen size. If you're looking at a desktop computer, the desktop computer will not include that little piece of information. But there's other pieces of information that are on here. So we have this Intel Core i5 3230M processor. What does that mean? Why do we care? That is the computer's brain. The processor is the brain of the computer. And these numbers relate a little bit to the speed of the computer and how the computer's brain is set up. Some of these computer brains have multiple pieces to them, and some of them are a single piece. And what I mean by that is you'll hear the word core. And sometimes you'll have dual core or quad core or even what they call hexacore processors these days. And so they don't always show that information on the label, but these processors may have multiple different cores, which means that it can fragment up its processing of information into more pieces and work on it simultaneously, work on more options, more activities at the same time. And so sometimes these numbers can have meaning as far as the number of processors. I think the easiest way to look at the processor information, if we look back at it again here, the easiest way to look at the processor information is if I'm looking at two computers and all things being equal, one says Core i3, one says Core i5, one says Core i7. Generally, the higher the number, the newer, the faster the processor. The same thing with the numbers that follow. If I'm looking at two Core i5s and one says 3230 and one says 36 something, then you're going to see that the 36 is going to be a little bit faster. So those will be the ways to look at those particular numbers is comparatively. Instead of looking for a specific thing within my price range, I will look at those numbers and see which one has the largest within those. But I think the more important comparison of numbers are the next numbers I'm going to show you here. So if you're looking at the product label, you have something called 8 GB of DDR3. This is what they call RAM, or random access memory. You also have something that says 750 GB or gigabytes of hard drive. Now when we're looking at hard drive versus RAM on the computer, the hard drive, the HDD, hard disk drive, versus the RAM is the comparison between long-term memory and short-term memory. So this is the same thing as in humans when we're looking at long-term versus short-term memory. The hard disk drive, your long-term memory, is for things you're not working on right now. It's for things you want to remember for later. And so it's your storage. It's your long-term ability to keep information even when the computer is off and not actually active. Whereas the short-term memory, the RAM, is what your computer can work on right now. And so the higher the RAM, the more things your computer can work on right this moment. And so maximizing the RAM can often maximize the performance of your computer. Now, depending upon your needs, and I'll talk a little bit about that more here in a moment, but depending upon your needs, you may be more interested in RAM and less interested in hard drive. RAM is generally beneficial for most people. So within your price range, I would always recommend looking for the most RAM on a machine that fits that particular range. And I generally would prioritize that above most other concerns to make sure that your computer stays relatively quick and feels rather snappy as you work with your machine. Also looking at hard drive, if you do a lot of multimedia, if you do a lot of video, PowerPoint presentations, music files, a lot of those things take up a lot more space. If you have a hard drive that's almost full, that can also cause your machine to slow down and cause your machine to have issues performing the way you would expect. So you don't want to overfill your hard drive space on your computer. And so that's another reason to be concerned about hard drive space. And so hard drive is measured in either gigabytes or terabytes. Gigabytes are the normal measurement you see today, and it's usually in hundreds of gigabytes. Terabytes, each terabyte is 1,000 gigabytes. And so if you're looking at a drive that says 2 TB, that's a 2 terabyte drive, or 2,000 gigabytes. And so that gives you some comparison ability between a 500 gigabyte drive versus a 2 terabyte drive, which is bigger, which is going to be able to handle more. So when you're looking at hard drives, that's going to be a concern. Also, when you're looking at hard drives, people have started doing something called solid-state drives. So if you see SSD on a computer, that means it's a solid-state drive. That means instead of having a hard drive like the one you see on my screen here, the hard drive looks slightly different. Inside of this particular hard drive, the one I have a picture of here, it has little platters that can be read and little arms that read it. Well, a solid-state drive actually looks a lot like a RAM chip on the inside. It has lots of these big square blocky chips, and all of it is stored electronically. There's no physical pieces moving around in a solid-state drive versus a traditional hard disk drive. And so they generally have lesser storage capacity. They're usually much smaller. They're measured in like 128 gigabytes or 256 gigabytes, usually not much more than that. And they're often much more expensive than solid-state, traditional hard disk drives, but they're generally much, much faster in reading data from them. So sometimes that's an advantage. So if you have a lot of data that you access a lot, if you have programs that you want to open really quickly, that solid-state drive can be very beneficial for snappy performance, but it doesn't have as much long-term storage. And so again, if you're doing a lot of video, a lot of multimedia type things, you may not have as much storage capacity long-term with those kinds of drives. So let's look back at some of these product labels. So here again is a product label. It has 8 gigabytes of DDR3. This is our RAM, and usually you'll see something like DDR3, DDR2, something like that as an indicator of the RAM on your machine. And this one only has a 500 gigabyte hard drive. And I say only because more and more commonly we're seeing anywhere from 500 to a terabyte in laptops. So 500 tends to be on the lower end of the spectrum right now. That may change as people move to solid-state drives. This number may actually look lower because of the type of drive that's in our computer. Now, when we're looking at these product labels, and let me show you a couple of different ones. So this is one from this particular provider. Here's another one, and you can see this has a Core i3 processor, less RAM. And when I'm looking at these two, I can tell because the Core i3 processor, i3 is a lower number than the i5, that the basic processor is probably faster on the i5 than the i3. This only has 4 gigabytes of RAM versus the 6 on this particular computer. So the 6 is going to make my machine have more short-term memory, so it's going to be able to perform more tasks at the same time and feel snappier because of that. They both have the same amount of long-term memory, the hard drive space. And so when we're looking at the hard drive space, those things are pretty equal. Now, depending upon my budget, I may choose one over the other depending upon where I'm at on that. And so that's going to be entirely a personal decision. You'll also notice that this has a much smaller screen than the other machine, and that can sometimes be a deciding factor as well. Sometimes you want a smaller screen for portability and lighter weight. Other times you want the larger screen to have an easier time viewing everything that's on your computer. Other examples from other manufacturers, you'll see that there's different companies that provide processors. So this is an Intel Core i3. This is from a company called AMD. And those processors don't have the same numbers, and so you can't necessarily compare them directly. So if I'm looking at Intel Core i3 versus AMD dual-core A6, those numbers don't mean anything comparatively. The fact that the A6 is higher than the i3 may or may not mean anything. So sometimes comparing processors is a very difficult process. And so I generally don't spend a lot of time comparing processors because most modern computers' processors are fast enough for the majority of applications that people have. Now, high-end applications that are data intensive and computer intensive would be things like creating multimedia videos, can sometimes be, but creating 3D animation where you're rendering 3D videos, that's going to be extremely computer intensive, and so that becomes more important for those kinds of operations. But generally, for most day-to-day people using the internet, using PowerPoint, using Word, using Excel even, these kinds of things don't matter as much. Now, if you're also a gamer, so if you're looking to buy a computer for a younger person who's really into computer games and high-end computer graphics processing, then that may make a difference. They may have a preference of a particular processor over another, but for most people, again, that's of less concern. Now, looking again back at the product label here, we can see how much RAM, again, 4 gigabytes DDR3, so very much like the other one, we can easily identify the RAM by looking for something that has this like DDR number on it. That'll be our RAM. 500 gigabyte HDD, there's our hard drive, so we have an idea of how much storage are on here. And they include some other pieces of information. The fact that this says DVD-RW, if you see DVD together, that means that there's actually a DVD drive in the computer. That's becoming something that's not always common anymore. So not every computer has a DVD drive in it or a Blu-ray drive in it. Sometimes, especially with some of these ultra-thin computers, there's not what they refer to as an optical drive, a DVD drive in the machine. And so if that's a concern for you, you may want to look for that particular option. Also on this product label, this particular reseller is providing us with information on the graphics card. And so sometimes you may see something that has a number with a G on it here at the end. That's often your graphics card. There's a couple of different companies that provide graphics cards. You have AMD that has their Radeon graphics cards. You have a company called NVIDIA that has its graphics cards. And then Intel and AMD both have their built-in graphics processors as well. That is only really important if you're doing really graphics-intensive things. Again, 3D animation, computer video games, especially some of your really high-end video games will require that, but for your average user, that's not as important. Again, also these product labels are including the screen resolution on here, the screen size, I should say, on here. Let me skip ahead a little bit here to looking at online product labels. Often when you go to a website, and I really recommend going to the website for whatever manufacturer or for whatever reseller is selling a particular computer, and looking at even a computer that they may have physically in the store, look at it online. Look at what they've got there, because the specifications is a lot more thorough. So it's easier to do side-by-side comparisons when you're looking at the labels on the website versus the actual store label. So if you look at the website label here, on the website they give you kind of the same kind of thing that you would see on the in-store product label, but you have an option to find specifications. And the specifications may be on another tab, or it may be below everything else when you're looking at it on the website. But as you look at the specifications here, let me go ahead and zoom in so we can see this a little bit better. We can see the width, the height. Eventually also on here you'll see the weight. Sometimes that's important, especially if you're looking at a laptop. You may want to know that this is a 7-pound laptop, or that this is a 3-pound laptop. That may be very important if you're going to be lugging it around with you. So that's going to be something that's here. So here where it says weight, 5.3 pounds, that may or may not be above our cutoff point. So that may be something that we want to consider when we're looking at a laptop. So that information is not always available on the in-store product label, but it's almost always available on the product label on a store's website. Also, I have the processor here. So again, I can see that this particular one has an AMD A10 processor. Again, I don't pay as close attention to processors as I do other pieces of information. At the bottom of this particular page here, I have 6 gig of RAM. So that gives me that system memory, RAM, and it's also much more clearly labeled as RAM here, so that you know that you're looking at the amount of RAM on the computer. So I have 6 gigabytes of RAM on this particular one. When I go to the next page here, I can see the hard drive size. And this particular hard drive has 750 gigabytes, so that's more than a 500 gigabytes. So if I'm looking at doing a lot of data storage, like multimedia, videos, and things like that, and all things being equal, I have one computer that has 750 gigabytes of hard drive and one that has 500, I may want to prioritize that 750 because I'm going to be storing data long term, maybe, like I say, multimedia type data. It also has my graphics card information here. Again, that's important for people doing computer games or 3D graphics of different kinds, and so that can be something to look at. So the number again on these is very much like looking at the number on the processor. The higher the numbers that come after that, generally the faster, the better the graphics cards. So if you're wanting to do a little bit of comparison on graphics cards, that can be a useful way of determining. But again, different manufacturers use different number schemes. So if you're looking at two different manufacturers' graphics cards, you may not be able to compare those numbers side by side, and it may require a little additional research to get an idea as to whether those graphics processors are comparable or not. And as I go through this, there's a lot of additional information, but you can kind of skim through most of this. Sometimes it's useful to be able to see whether or not a particular computer has certain features. If I'm looking for a computer that can be connected to a TV, having what's called an HDMI port may be important if I'm trying to connect it to a home television. So if I'm wanting to connect my computer to a home television, most newer home televisions have an HDMI port on them. That may be something I'm looking for on the computer as well. So I can look through and see what kind of ports are available on the computer. Also, on the product label on the store, they don't normally have this because you can usually look at the computer there in the store to find out for yourself. But on the website, it also includes information on how many USB ports are on the computer. USB ports are important because most of our external devices plug into USB ports. And so if we intend to have a mouse connected to our laptop or an external hard disk drive or some other devices attached, maybe we want to include a webcam or something like that attached to our device. If that's the case, we may be interested in how many USB ports are on the computer. Also, whether or not the computer has a built-in webcam or a built-in set of speakers. Those things are all available to be found on the specifications page on the store's website. So as you look at these, you can see lots of different information on these. Here's a different store's version. So this particular store has things laid out slightly differently. On their page, you'd have to scroll down. They don't have a button to get to the specifications. But if you're looking at the specifications, you can see a lot of the same pieces of information. So I have the memory, which in this case, total memory size, and just below that we see DDR3, so this would be our RAM. So I can see how much RAM is on here. As I look down, here's my processor again. I can see hard drive specifications. This happens to have a 500 gigabyte hard drive. I have my graphics information, my audio specifications, how many media ports. This one happens to have an HDMI port if that was of interest to me, and all of those kinds of pieces of information. And here's one additional manufacturer and provider. So again, they have their specifications listed here. You can see shipping weight, which is going to give you an idea of how much the machine weighs. Hard drive capacity is 640 gigabytes. System RAM is 4 gigabytes, and processor information. So these kinds of information can be very useful when comparing your computer. So hopefully that helped you out some. Hopefully when you go to buy your next computer, some of this is going to be more meaningful for you. And thank you again for joining us on Byte Basics.